taxpayer funding in this, the payback may be deferred into the future. Right, let's get to the front page of the Daily Telegraph. They go on this. Truss vows never again on energy bills. PM pledges to revolutionise supply as she takes action to ease household fuel crisis. What do you make of this, Anand?
Well, I think it's very sensible. I think it's the kind of long-term thinking we need. I wonder whether there's going to be the bandwidth to take the sorts of long-term decisions while we're in the heat of this crisis that the Prime Minister is hinting at there. And it's worth remembering that whatever we do in the way of increasing security of supply now is not going to have much impact on this crisis whatsoever. So, I mean, there are two separate things. I mean, there is the here and now, which is spiraling energy bills for households and businesses. And there is the medium term, which is what do we do about security of supply and how do we deal with the debts we will have accrued because we've dealt with the high prices now. So this is a crisis that will unfold in several stages. But I have to say, I'm reassured that the Prime Minister is thinking in these terms now, because it would be all too easy to get carried away with the immediate crisis and not think longer term.
Yeah, and that's exactly what the front page of the Daily Telegraph pick out, saying she wants to revolutionise energy supply in Britain so that soaring bills this winter would never be repeated. Presumably a part of that would involve things like more investment in solar. But you remember from the hustings, she said few things make her more sad than the sight of solar panels in farmers' fields. So perhaps something on that will have to change. Who knows? Right, let's move on to the front page of the Daily Mirror. The Daily Mirror consistently, obviously, been taking a slightly different tone to lots of the other newspapers over the last few days. Their headline is simply "About Time." PM Truss bows to Mirror's demand for bills freeze on first day in office, but she refuses to make energy firms pay. Annabelle.
Yes, well, it was news to me, I have to say, that there was a Mirror demand that the new Prime Minister was bowing to, but they certainly seem to be pleased that she's pressing ahead with the energy freeze, which of course Keir Starmer announced his support for back in August and saw a resulting boost in his popularity ratings directly after that. But yes, the Mirror will be perturbed by the fact that Liz Truss is against windfall taxes. Now, I share the new Prime Minister's position on windfall taxes. I think that they will disincentivise investment. They will stifle competition in the energy market, the sorts of things that we really need if we're going to boost supply to meet demand in the future. So I think Liz Truss is right to be rowing back on some of the measures that the Conservative government announced earlier this year, but it will be to the dismay of Mirror editorial team and their readers, perhaps.
Indeed. And let's have a quick moment just to reflect back on today, because it has been a significant day. Prime Minister's questions, first under Liz Truss, not referenced on the papers because clearly they're focusing on tomorrow. But it's the first opportunity the UK public has had to see what kind of Prime Minister she will be. What did you make of it?
I mean, I thought the whole sort of spectacle was slightly lacking in energy today, but substantively what I thought was interesting was we saw a debate between Keir Starmer and Liz Truss about policy. And under Boris Johnson, the tone of the debate was very, very different. And with the two sides staking out very, very different economic ideologies, which looks like creating the battleground for the next election. So Keir Starmer, far more interventionist, wants to know how these debts can be paid for, wants to help the worse off and prioritise that. Liz Truss with the focus on growth, with the focus on whatever it takes to make the economy grow, that's what I'll do. And the focus isn't on redistribution. So, you know, I think the battle lines are getting drawn very, very early on because both parties realise that even if we're out of the immediate cost of living crisis that we're experiencing now, the economy is going to dominate our political lives for the next 2 years until the next election.
Well, it's really interesting to kind of, that we can gather so much so quickly. Same question to you, Annabelle. What are your reflections after today?
Well, I think Anand is absolutely right that this was a policy debate, and I think it is setting the tone for the next 2 years, if indeed the next general election is in 2024, as Liz Truss said back on Monday. And I welcome this, that the two leaders of the two main parties in the UK will be playing the ball and not the man, and talking about, the economy, talking about policy, talking about tackling the cost of living crisis, albeit from very different perspectives. But yes, it was a more muted debate in the Commons chamber today. And I think to an extent there was goodwill towards Liz Truss. The commentary saying that she had quite an easy ride. It could get a little bit more ferocious in the weeks to come. But I think it will be a very different tone to what we've seen in the past few months, with scandal upon scandal emerging and that really dominating the agenda at PMQs.
Indeed.
And I think, can I just...
Yeah.
I was just going to add, I think there's almost a sense of a kind of collective holding of breath at the moment until we see the details of the package on the energy crisis. Everyone knows that what the Prime Minister unveils tomorrow is absolutely fundamental, not just to the energy crisis, but to her political future. How it lands, how it's received with her own party, with people, with the experts who'll pour over the details, and crucially with the electorate. And there's this sort of sense that we're all waiting to see what happens. And I suspect next week's Prime Minister's questions will be a far feistier affair than this week's.
Interesting. We look forward to that then. Annabelle, we're going to go to the front page of the Daily Express, and I'll prove I'm a woman of action is their headline, looking ahead to tomorrow. We don't need to go over the same ground that we've already been over, but I do just want to ask you, because it's one detail that they pick out, as all the papers have, and that we've mentioned, is this idea of the windfall tax on energy firms' excess profits. It was an attack line by Sir Keir Starmer in PMQs. It doesn't look like Liz Truss is going to budge on it at all. Do you think we're going to continue to hear about this?
I suspect that now that the Prime Minister has ruled it out, and she didn't leave herself much wiggle room there, if she does decide to proceed with a windfall tax or increase the existing energy profits levy, then those words will come back to haunt her. So I think that we can assume that a line has been drawn under windfall taxes on energy companies. We need to be careful about this narrative around excess profits. We need to bear in mind that these profits are global, that this is money that has been made globally, not just in the UK, and is therefore not exclusively taxable in the UK. And we also need to bear in mind that when these companies are making these so-called excess profits, that they're paying an enormous amount in tax. These energy companies, at least in the North Sea, the North Sea oil and gas companies, are paying 65% tax. So that's vast sums of money that are already pouring into the Treasury coffers that I think don't really get mentioned very much when we talk about profiteering energy companies, making huge amounts at the expense of the...
Anand, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I mean, I'd say a couple of things. I think the debate about the windfall tax is part of a broader debate, which we alluded to earlier with those words from Philip Hammond, is there is a debate to be had about whether we should be absolutely relaxed about the deficit going forward with higher interest rates, or whether we need to have a conversation about how to start to pay it back, and whether that will include tax rises down the line. So I think one way or another, this question about what we should do with the debt we're racking up to deal quite rightly with the energy crisis now is one that will happen both within the Prime Minister's own party and in the country at large. Okay,
let's move finally to the front page of The Guardian. We're going to ignore the Liz Truss headline because we have covered it, but we're going to look at the picture. It is a fabulous picture on the front. Well played. Walsh breaks world record for women's transfer fee. I don't know if we're all football fans here, but Anand, why don't you kick us off?
Well, I think this speaks to the increased popularity and status of women's football following the recent Euros. It's, I think, a £400,000 transfer fee to Barcelona, which is a new record for women's game. I think it's worth putting this into perspective in the context of the absurd sums that are still being splashed around in the men's game. There's a Chelsea story today about them having to pay Brighton £15 million to get their manager. So there's still a ways to go, but I think it is absolute progress for the women's game. A, that there seems to be more money coming into it, and B, of course, that it is on the front page of a newspaper like The Guardian. I think that marks real progress. Yeah,
Annabelle, you couldn't, I presume when we look back on the history of women's football, the dividing line of these Euros, especially in England, will be such a moment in terms of coverage and interest before and after.
Yeah, an absolute turning point for the women's game, and it's already come on leaps and bounds. And I think its popularity, the interest in it, the media coverage that it's going to get, as well as the support that we will begin to have for individual players, or increasingly have for individual players, individual teams. The momentum is really there now, and I think we're a long way off matching the men's game, but huge progress has been made, and that's to be celebrated and welcomed.
Indeed, I'm delighted we got one non-politics story in there. Anand, Annabelle, thank you very much for talking us through the papers. Thank you. And they will be back at 11:30, where we will have another look through the front pages. Do join us then if you can. For now, though, I'm Lewis Vaughan-Jones. Bye-bye. Hello, welcome to our look ahead to what the papers will be bringing us tomorrow. With me, Annabelle Denham, Director of Communications at free market think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, and Anand Menon, Director of the think tank, the UK in a Changing Europe, which describes itself as providing independent research on Brexit and its impact. We will say hello to both in just a moment. First, though, let's take a look at the actual front pages. We'll start with the Eye, which previews tomorrow's announcement on energy bills, saying Liz Truss will unveil emergency support, but leaves questions over how it will be funded. The Times reports that the £150 billion package will rely on government borrowing to hold bills steady for 2 years. About time, says the Mirror, but criticises the decision not to expand the windfall tax on oil and gas firms to pay for it. The Telegraph claims the new PM will revolutionise energy supplies, with more drilling in the North Sea and an end to the ban on fracking. It's Liz's energy revolution, according to the Mail, but the paper gives much of its front page to a picture of the Cambridges on the first day of school. Elsewhere, the Metro covers the killing of 19-year-old Ashley Wadsworth. 23-year-old Jack Seppel has admitted murdering her after meeting on a dating app in Essex earlier this year. And a big picture of Lionesses midfielder Kira Walsh in The Guardian. She signed a world record deal to move from Manchester City to Barcelona, worth £400,000. So good evening, and good evening to you both. Let's crack straight on. It is a big day in politics, big day for the country tomorrow, and of course that dominates tomorrow's front pages. We're going to start with the Times. Their headline, £150 billion scheme to freeze energy bills for 2 years. Now, I'm old enough to remember when the bill was only 100 billion. That was about 48 hours ago. Anand, why don't you kick us off this way?
Yeah, I mean, this is the story on virtually all the front pages. It's the scheme that Liz Truss is going to announce tomorrow to try and cap energy prices at around £2,500 a year for households. She's also expected to do something to help businesses who are struggling with the increase in energy prices as well. Many different aspects to this, the first of which I think for the Prime Minister is how well one of the
Anand, we're going to jump in there because you froze twice. The whole last paper review, you were absolutely perfect. And so I'm sure there's nothing too fundamentally wrong with your signal, but we're going to just check it and come back to you. Annabelle, do you want to take over with the Times front page?
Yeah, sure. Well, as Anand was saying, this really is the story in town, what the new Prime Minister is planning to do to tackle the cost of living crisis, particularly soaring energy bills with the price cap due to rise again in October and be simply unaffordable for lots of families. We've heard a lot of politicians talking about the dilemma, awful dilemma that people are going to face between heating and choosing between heating and eating. And I have to say, at least we are now now talking about this. At least we have a new Prime Minister able to get her teeth into this issue rather than the interminable leadership contest that absorbed so much time and energy at a really crucial moment for the country. So yes, this is the energy plan. It could cost £150 billion. This is a vast sum of money. It previously had been compared to the furlough scheme that came with around a £70 billion price tag. Now, as I've said before, the difference here is that furlough was targeted. It was targeted at people who weren't able to work because the government had implemented a lockdown, whereas this is indiscriminate. And the concern that many hold, particularly some economists, is that it not being targeted, it's going to be very expensive. It's going to help those who don't really need the support when we should be cushioning the impact primarily for the most vulnerable households. And the other issue which Paul Johnson has raised, which is also on the cover of the Times, is the fact that it's not going to disincentivize people from using energy. It may not lead to a massive reduction in energy use among households, and therefore it's going to prolong this crisis. But
Annabelle, let's just focus in on exactly that, because that's a really interesting point, and it is on the front page of the Times, as you mentioned, their second article. Ministers will implore public to cut use of power. Now, this is really significant, because it's a very different message from anything we heard from the previous government, and even during the leadership contest, Rishi Sunak, I think, refused to rule anything in or out, but we didn't seem to be getting that message from the Truss camp. But it now seems very squarely on the table. They're talking here about things like public information campaigns over the winter to encourage people to turn down their thermostats. This is a big change.
Yeah, it's a marked change in direction from Boris Johnson, who was very reluctant to talk to the British public about how they might adjust their energy use this winter. Of course, nobody wants to hear the words rationing, particularly not Liz Truss on her third day as Prime Minister. But I think that does increasingly seem to be what we're looking at here. Of course, we're already seeing pretty drastic measures being taken on the continent, public buildings switching off their lights in the evenings, for instance. We could potentially see similar measures being introduced here. My concern, while I think that rationing may be necessary in order to get us through this winter, it will be contingent on what happens to things like the wholesale energy, gas prices. It will depend, of course, on how cold the winter is. But my concern is that the COVID pandemic has slightly changed how we live with these sorts of crises, what we're willing to accept. And while we may be okay with rationing this winter, I would be very worried about that becoming a longer term trend. So what the government really needs to do is address ways of increasing supply, our security of supply, and reducing our dependency on imports.
Absolutely. We're going to come to that issue with a couple of the other front pages. Anand, I hope you're back. What you may have missed there is the front page of the Times just talking about this idea of rationing, public information campaigns, telling us to turn down the thermostat. Very different messaging from what we've heard so far.
Yeah, I mean, as Annabelle said, it's very different from the previous government. But I suppose the issue here is, if the government is going to act to cap our bills, there's no price signal to make us reduce our use of energy. And so if they're going to cap our bills, they need to come out with a message to make us reduce that energy usage. So I think it's a twofold strategy. Along with the money that they're ploughing in to limit the amount we have to pay, they're hammering home that message at the same time. Don't be profligate with the energy you use, because energy is scarce.
Indeed. And let's go now to the front page of the Daily Mail to get on to this issue that Annabelle alluded to, which is trying to increase our supply of energy, because even if the price is capped, doesn't mean there's necessarily going to be enough of it. And in the long term, we need to increase our independence when it comes to energy anyway. So Liz's energy revolution is the headline in the Daily Mail. But, Annabelle, underneath here it says, launch new dash for North Sea gas and restart fracking. These are not going to keep climate change activists happy at all.
No, and of course they're not going to keep some NIMBYs happy either, those who have vehemently opposed fracking over the last, well, nearly decade. I think this is absolutely welcome move. Like I said, we have to look at ways of reducing our dependency on foreign imports. Of course, it's important that we have a low carbon transition, but I think oil and gas, at least in the short term, are going to be an important part of that. And that was actually what was set out in the 2019 Conservative Manifesto. We need to look at ways of reducing our dependence on oil and gas, but while accepting that in the short term, at least, with technology as it is, we simply are not able to move to net zero any sooner, certainly than the 2050 target. If you just look at our energy market, it's been tampered with and taxed for so many years that it scarcely resembles a market at all. And, it's really welcome that the new Prime Minister is trying to look at ways of rowing back on some of the pretty disastrous measures that successive governments have implemented.
But all those methods haven't saved us from this. The argument ought to be that they haven't gone far enough. If we should have moved further away from oil and gas, so we're not as dependent on wholesale prices, gone more into solar, more into wind, more quickly. That would have helped alleviate this situation, not the opposite.
Well, sure. We've obviously massively invested in renewables and we ought to continue to do so. But the technology where it is at present and the intermittency issues mean that we are still dependent on gas in particular to deal with some of the shortcomings of renewables, at least in the short term. And we've imported gas while having a leave it in the ground mentality here in the UK. And you only need to the fracking revolution that brought down energy bills in the US enormously and that provided a lot of jobs and brought a number of other benefits of that kind to see, the missed opportunity that we've had here in Britain. And
yes, let's bring in Anand on that point then. What do you make of this dash for North Sea gas and restart fracking as a plan?
Well, I take the point, firstly, that we shouldn't forget our climate commitments. And one of the striking things is how the climate crisis hasn't been mentioned by the new Prime Minister. It's also probably worth bearing in mind that fracking isn't going to solve this immediate problem. And in a political sense, what I'm quite curious about is whether the former Prime Minister is going to feel moved to speak about this, because the one time he had what seemed to be a dig at Liz Truss during the leadership was over climate and over fracking. And this is clearly not the direction of travel he would have chosen. It will be interesting to see if Boris Johnson chooses to speak out on this or not.
OK, let's get to the front page of the Financial Times, because the state of the pound is a story on quite a few of the papers, actually. The Financial Times headline there is "Pound slides as markets shudder at scale of challenge facing Truss." And basically the headline is that the sterling is the weakest since 1985, Annabelle.
Yes, so there's quite alarmist headlines across a couple of media publications in tomorrow's. But I think that we should not take it to heart too much. Yes, the pound fell 0.4% against the dollar, but that's a very strong dollar. The FTSE 250 remained unchanged, and it's ultimately not surprising that we're seeing bond markets shudder. These are huge sums that we're talking about, like we said about the cover of the Times, perhaps up to 150 billion pounds. But there was a bit of a rebound in the pound towards the end of the day today, so I don't think we should be too alarmist or too concerned about it. And let's not forget that the euro plummeted to a record low against the dollar just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, not great times for the euro either. Let's go to the front page of the I just want to mention it because it's basically the same story, that Truss reveals energy gamble as pound hits 1985 low. And as you pointed out, that is also mainly a reflection of the strength of the dollar is so extraordinary in risk-off times, Anand.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got to remind ourselves the dollar is strong. The Americans aren't having the same sort of energy crisis that we're having. Nevertheless, the wobbles in the pound do point to a potential future danger, which is the market starting to get squeamish about the amounts of debt that the British state is taking on. And that's something, at least for the...
Anand is teasing
Whilst
us
not
again.
a significant threat now. I'm sorry. Some people say
you've got again. Let's go to Annabelle on this, and let's bring in because Anna was just about to neatly go on and talk about it. We can look at the front page of the Daily Mirror, and their headline is about time. PM Truss bows to Mirror's demand for bills freeze, which I think you'll have something to say about that. But the issue here is who pays for it. And there's been a call from Labour that it should be a windfall tax extension to make sure that those who are profiting from this war, which is those big energy companies, pay for it and not taxpayers, Annabelle.
Sure. Well, I mean, to the energy freezing plan, that's not something I personally would support. As we've discussed, it's going to be very expensive and it won't be targeted. It won't help the most vulnerable households specifically. And public finances are in a parlous state. Let's not forget that only very recently we spent £400 billion helping save lives and livelihoods during the coronavirus pandemic. We are borrowing pretty astronomical sums, and we've got to service that debt as well. So, understandable concerns about that. But when it comes to footing the bill, the Mirror is clearly dismayed that the Conservatives are not pressing ahead with another windfall tax on energy firms. I personally think that would be a mistake. What we don't want to be doing now is disincentivizing investment. We don't want to be stifling competition, and that's precisely what a windfall tax would do. So,
even though, is that true? Even though these profits are directly from a war, I mean, doesn't that make it slightly uncomfortable for these companies to be taking this money anyway? And people thinking about investing in the UK would surely be able to separate. Oh, well, actually, these profits are made by actual war. You can't be profiteering off the back of war. Maybe that is a slightly different decision from an investment in the UK decision.
Well, I think you have to bear in mind that these companies are operating in a very volatile market. There are some years when they will experience excess, as they're called, profits, but other years, well, they'll be running at a loss. And I haven't heard anything from any politician about what would happen in those years when they aren't making any profits. Would they get some kind of rebate on the windfall tax? I find it quite hard to believe.
But this is different. This is from a war. This is from an actual war. Like, there's no one's talking about doing arbitrary windfall taxes of energy companies when they happen to have a bumper year and make loads of money. This is an actual Putin invasion of Ukraine. It's very different from normal investment decisions and arbitrary windfall taxes just because companies are doing well, isn't it?
Well, I think we have to be careful about the term excess profits and bear in mind that these companies are operating globally and there's a limit to the amount that would be taxable here in the UK. And we also need to bear in mind that they're already paying corporation tax at a higher level plus a supplementary charge. So when these companies are making higher profits, there's a huge amount of money that is already pouring into the Treasury coffers that we hear very little about. And let's not forget that this windfall tax, it's going to be a drop in the ocean compared to the potential £150 billion price tag that the energy plan will come with. So we're going to have to look at other ways of footing the bill. And the new Prime Minister is absolutely right that we're going to need to borrow more money in order to support people through this winter. And we need to see the deficit as a longer term issue that can be dealt with over time. But, that said, she's obviously clear that this is a short-term one-off hit to get people through this winter, and then she has a longer plan to try and boost our independence, energy independence.
Anand, what do you make of this, that the public will have to foot this bill in some way at some point?
I mean, I'd say two things, assuming I'm not frozen. The first is I'd just be a bit careful about using the word profiteering, because what's happening is these energy companies are getting profits because the global price of oil has gone up because of a war. But I mean, they're not profiting directly from a war. That sounds sort of worse, I think, than it really is. But we're going to have to figure out how to pay for this deficit. And particularly in the event that the great Liz Truss gamble, which is that tax cuts will lead to growth, which will help the public finances in the medium term, doesn't come off, we're going to be left with a bill, and at some point we're going to have a debate, and I suspect that debate is going to happen both between the Conservative Party and within the Conservative Party about who should be paying for this, over how long, and when we should confront those debts and start trying to get them down. Servicing that debt is going to be an issue.
Okay, we did manage to get through that answer, Alan. We heard you loud and clear. Thank you very much for that. And I'm afraid I'm out of time. But Annabelle, great to have you on. Thank you so much for your thoughts. Anand too, great to have you on. Thank you very much for taking us through the papers. And that is it for this edition of The Papers. Do join us at same time tomorrow. For the